Welcome back to the Power 2 here on College Football Addiction. TJ Pittinger, Cole Thompson, Tom Hannifan with you again. Boys, how's your week been?
Solid. Can't complain, man. Life is good.
Happy Ash Wednesday to all who celebrate, or better known as in my like of the word, tell me you're Catholic without telling me you're Catholic Day. So there we go. Everyone, hopefully you're having a good start to Lent if you celebrate, and if not, well, you know what? I'm just happy to talk college football because we got a fun show today. Very fun show to talk about.
Yeah, I'm hoping we don't offend too many people with our first segment, but if we do,
I don't care.
I don't care at all.
Yeah, it'll be all right. And if we offend you with another segment, then, again, it kind of just is what it is. But
still don't care at all.
Each and every Wednesday, live at noon Eastern, and then you can find the clips later on throughout the week here on College Football Addiction, the Power 2. Boys, let's jump right into it. Saw an article this week. Actually, Tom shared it in the group chat about Carson Beck wearing the number 11 down at Miami. Obviously, some significance there. Ken Dorsey, probably the best quarterback they've had outside of Cam Ward's 1 year. Since Miami's been, for however long, right? 25 years at this point. Now, not necessarily saying he's going to be the next Ken Dorsey or anything like that, but let's talk about Miami just in general. And I want to kind of get you guys' thoughts. I've been pretty, as a pure-on hater, I've been pretty honest about Miami and the fact that I do think that they are, are they certainly not back, but like rising up, doing, kind of getting closer to being back than not. They've shown progress in Mario. What are your thoughts? We can go Tom first since you shared it, but what are your thoughts on just Miami in general, the state of the program, where they are this year, going forward, Carson Beck, just all inclusive? This is not our Miami preview. We will do that a little bit deeper dive later on in the offseason, but just thoughts on Miami, Tom.
Yeah, it's a weird study when you look at Miami because I would lump them in with these schools like Ole Miss, for instance, and Mizzou has done a lot of this, trying to build through the transfer portal, Texas Tech, etc. Miami's right up there with them. And it's been known for a long time, even before this stuff was legal, that Miami was going to spend heavily on its football program. So you've seen how they've benefited from the transfer portal, but they're also this great case study of you can't necessarily build a complete team through the transfer portal. Now, they hit the jackpot with Cam Ward last year, and Cam Ward made up for a lot of things that Miami was not really great at, and he elevated that offense in a lot of ways. I wouldn't say he had the greatest weapons at his disposal. We all know about Xavier Restrepo, but outside of that, Arroyo at tight end you were excited about, and he got more traction as the draft, is inched closer and closer. So it's not like he had an elite offense that he was working with and they made him look good. He made them look good. And then defensively, they couldn't stop anybody. They didn't have that killer instinct to finish. Mario Cristobal has been fraudulent and questionable since leaving Oregon, in my opinion. My concern with Miami is they're just going to continue to be like, let's build through the transfer portal. And that brings me to Carson Beck. I think Carson Beck is poised to have a very disappointing year. And I will point towards some statistics for you because it's my favorite thing when it comes to Carson Beck. I want to compare two stat lines for you guys so that you can have a side-by-side. These are two different quarterbacks, and I'm stealing one from Carton on Fox, but give me a shot here. 63.2 completion percentage, 4,036 yards passing, 26 touchdowns, 13 interceptions. Decent little year, right? Not too bad, okay? Let's go to quarterback number 2. 64.7% completion percentage, 3,485 yards passing, 28 passing touchdowns, 12 interceptions. Also not bad, but still, leaves something to be desired, right? Would you like to know who those two quarterbacks are?
One is Carson Beck and the other one is either Cam Ward or Garrett Nussmeier.
Quarterback number 2 is Carson Beck from last season. Quarterback number 1 is 2011 Brock Osweiler from Arizona State.
I didn't know we were going that far.
In my opinion, Carson Beck, very similar build and athlete, all those sorts of measurables. Oh, God, he's the prototypical quarterback, all that sort of stuff. A little bit shorter than Osweiler, but still, they're the same. I am tired of everybody anointing this guy as potentially the best quarterback in football. Yes, he had a real nice year in 2023 when he was surrounded by weapons, Lad McConkey, Brock Bowers, and a killer offensive line. And that was kind of the beginning of the gradual decline of the way that Georgia was just killing it in recruiting, as we've seen lately. Not that they haven't done badly, but obviously there's been a drop off. I don't buy Carson Beck. And on top of that, he's coming off of a major injury to his throwing arm. Do we expect him to be good to go in week 0, week 1, week 2, week 3? Like, at what point are you getting back allegedly the return on investment for $4 million? He is having his Lamborghinis stolen left and right. He's living in Miami with his girlfriend, who is an enormous social media presence and probably a distraction in a good way. Good for you, Carson. I'm envious, really. But still, I don't see how this is supposed to work out, that you see an upgrade from the Cam Ward year at Miami to now the Carson Beck year. This feels like a guy who understands he has hype and he's cashing in at the college level. I am not against that. I want college guys to get paid and make money while they are relevant. But this will be the end of Carson Beck's relevance, and I think it's been a misstep by Miami.
So before I go to Cole, the one thing I will push back on, and it sickens me to defend Miami in any way, I do think their recruiting has been pretty good. Like, I don't know that I would buy fully that they're going the Ole Miss, Florida State route of building through the portal. Their first year under Mario, they recruited number 13 overall. Their next 2 years were number 8 and number 6, according to 247. Last year, a little bit of a drop off, surprisingly, with winning 10 games, back down to 13. But I do think they've, in some areas, built really well. DB is one of those. I think they've done really well along the trenches. Both their offensive line and defensive line are really good. Now, they have some things to clean up because I don't think they've done a great job at some other positions, and they certainly haven't found that quarterback that hasn't been from the portal or from a previous regime. But I will say, I think they have built it slightly differently than even a Florida State or an Ole Miss. And their recruiting has been, I mean, it's been the best in the big three, you know, in the state, or anyone in the state of Florida, right? So I think that they've recruited well enough to lay some of that foundation. You mentioned not having some of the weapons. One thing they did have was a very elite running game. Now, they got Martinez out of the portal from Oregon State, but the offensive line contributed that significantly. I mean, how many times did we watch Cam Ward sit back there with 15 seconds to just kind of make a sandwich and then throw a ball downfield to Restrepo? The offensive line, they've built the right way through the high school recruiting ranks. It's taken Mario some time to build that up. And I think they've done that on the defensive line too. And we know that games are won in the trenches ultimately. And I think they're going to have offense and defensive lines, maybe, again, the best kind of combo in the ACC. And so, yeah, does that stack up to Georgia's or Bama's or Ohio State's or Penn State's? Probably not. But I think for the level of competition that they'll play, they've built it the right way there. Now, again, they haven't hit at quarterback. They're really excited about the Luke Nickel kid coming in this year to maybe take over for Beck going forward after his time in Miami. But that's the one thing that I'll agree on kind of the most of it. And then again, it makes me sick to have to defend Miami. But I think they have recruited maybe slightly better than we're giving them credit for there in your diatribe.
Well, I'll push in the middle ground between both of you. Let's start out with the fact that last season, it felt like very similar to 2023 LSU. An offense good enough to win a national title, a defense that kept you out of the college football playoff. The reality is that in 2023, LSU would have gone to the playoff in a 12-team format where Miami shot itself in the foot too many times. And there were so many close calls that we had to go back to that could have easily turned in any direction. The Virginia Tech game being the big one, where if you just look and see how the ball came down, if it was called a touchdown, it should have stayed a touchdown. If it was called an incomplete pass, should have been an incomplete pass. But regardless, it felt like last year Miami kind of pushed all of its chips into the pile. We're invested in 2024. Get the veteran quarterback to build off of what we have with Shannon Dawson's style of play. Add a secondary wide receiver in Samuel Brown to pair along with Xavier Restrepo. Get a fully healthy Elijah Arroyo in the passing game as at the tight end spot. Upgrade at running back with Damian Martinez coming on in from Oregon State. They went out and they bettered their defensive line by adding in guys like Simeon Barrow and Tyler Barron, and all of them hit in terms of, yeah, they got paid, but half of them really didn't show that production. And the Carson Beck thing, I vehemently disagree with Tom on this one, where we say we're anointing him. We're anointing him because if he's been able to show you that he's good enough to take you to, I think, at least an SEC championship. He did 2 years in a row. Now, the turnovers, big deal. I brought this up many a time. He has the same amount of turnovers as Garrett Nussmeier, who had 115 more pass attempts than him in the SEC. So it's a big deal, and you got to cut down on it. But also, how many of those turnovers came on drop balls by wide receivers or batted passes up in the air in Georgia? Georgia led the country in drops last season. And I'm not saying that the wide receiver core is going to be great this year down in Miami because you lost Isaiah Horton, you lost Xavier Restrepo, you lost Samuel Brown and Jacoby George, and you also lost a really good tight end in Arroyo. But you did bring in some names that I'm very excited to see. I think CJ Daniels could be a very good complementary piece. I think Alex Bauman coming on in from Tulane can be probably a good 3-down moving of the chains type of tight end. And if Beck is at least somewhat stable and they have a good ground game of Mark Fletcher, this should be a team to where at least we're saying 9 wins is possible again, 10 wins is possible again. A shot to go to Charlotte and compete for an ACC title should be on the horizon. But at this moment, now it feels like all the pressure is in on Mario. Remember, they fired Manny Diaz for underwhelming success when he was still taking them to bowl games, and now we're looking at what Cristobal has done. Yeah, sure, you got to a 9-3 finish in the regular. I mean, a 10-2 finish in the regular season, but you lost to Iowa State in the bowl game, in the Pop-Tarts Bowl. And I get it. You talk about how players opt out. It's a big time deal, but this is Miami. There's pride there. There is expectations there. There are goals that were achievable this past season. And all we hear about is your recruiting. All we hear about is how you recruit extremely well. You bring in the right type of talents. And they do. They have a stellar offensive line that has been homegrown internally. That is such a challenge for quality teams to find these days. They've been able to, establish, a good identity defensively at the linebacker position in the secondary. They aren't so codependent on the transfer portal being their only asset. But you can recruit as much as you want. If you have sour ingredients, the recipe is going to stink at the end of the day. And that's where the common ground is with Mario Cristobal. You can be a good recruiter. How does that translate onto the field? Because you shouldn't be going near overtime against a team like Cal, a 5-7 Cal team. You shouldn't be having to hope and pray that a catch comes down against Virginia Tech when they lose to Vanderbilt as a 2-score favorite in week 1 in a stadium that wasn't fully built at the time. You shouldn't be playing close against a Syracuse squad or against a Louisville squad or against any program for that matter. And frankly, that's my frustration with this Miami team. They have the talent. They've always had the talent. They don't do anything with the talent. And in a lot of ways, it reminds me of like the Dallas Cowboys. We're waiting for them to come back. We're waiting for them to come back. We're waiting for them to come back. They bring in some really fun names. And then lo and behold, we know what the expectations are. A first-round exit in the playoffs and a bunch of bitching and moaning in the offseason. That's it without the postseason picture for Mario Cristobal.
Yeah, I think the way their season unfolded too was such a disappointment. I will say, again, this is making me sick. I think that Miami getting to a place where 10 wins is disappointing is probably good for their program. Because 5 years ago, you just said getting 10 wins, they'd have jumped over backwards to do that, right? They did it 1 year under Rick, right? But I think that is objectively getting to. But if their season had played out differently, obviously it started so hot by going into the swamp and beating the hell out of their rivals. But then they've been bad in November and late. His first year, they were 2-2 in November. They were 1-3, or they were 1-3 his first year. They were 2-2 his next year, and they went 2-2 this year. And they've just been bad towards the end of seasons. Like they have fallen off, and that's going to be the challenge. I think what's interesting about them this year is their toughest 2 games, without question. Their toughest 2 games are out of conference. Yeah. They play Notre Dame to open up, and then they play Florida in like week 3 or 4. I can't remember if they have a bye before, and then it's Florida. But they play both of them in the first month. And then outside of that, they avoid Clemson. They do play Florida State on the road. Again, I would certainly take them over Florida State right now. We'll see what they look like early in the year. They do play Louisville and SMU, which I don't think those are just give-me games. But outside of that, if you can get through that first month at 3-1, right? You split with those big 2, or somehow if you go 4-0, it's just, is there that fall off of the cliff moment? Because if not, man, there's no excuse for them to not. There was really no excuse for them to not be in Charlotte last year.
There was none, just none, in my opinion.
I agree with that.
There's nobody on this schedule in the ACC that they should be losing to, right? We're high on Louisville. Maybe they can. But they still shouldn't lose that game, right? That's down in South Florida. They play Florida State early in the year again. Again, will Florida State be back? I wouldn't predict it even as being a homer. They got to go to SMU. That's not a terribly difficult place to play. I think that's a fun matchup, but you could drop one of those, right? You get to drop one of those. You don't have to play Clemson. You shouldn't drop to Florida State. So it's really like if you split with Louisville and SMU, you should be in Charlotte and playing your way into potentially an ACC championship. Now that might be against Clemson. That might be your third loss. That might keep you out. But if they don't make it to Charlotte this year, I mean, they're not firing Mario for going 9-3 or 10-2 and missing the playoffs. But you do have to question, okay, if not now, when?
The other thing that's really important, guys, is that if they lose those 2 out-of-conference games, they can only afford 1 loss to then make it to Charlotte, and then they have to win the ACC because you're not getting a 4-loss team in the playoff. I don't care if you are 7-1 in conference play, a 4-loss team is not going to the postseason, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'd agree there. So Miami's a big TBD.
I could see them losing anywhere from 2 to 5 games.
I could easily see 7
to your point about that.
Yeah.
I could see that to your point about the late season collapse. It all depends. And again, when does Carson play?
Yeah, and if they were to, which I don't think they will, right? Like even the biggest Miami hater in me right now, like I don't think they'll lose to both Notre Dame and Florida, but it's entirely plausible. Like I think both those teams are really good and have a chance to. Florida, obviously, they're in different stratospheres, but like Florida on the come up, Notre Dame continuing on. I think, and then the Beck factor. But if they were to lose both those early, does the team just mail it in, right? Like at that point, I mean, they shouldn't because, again, the ACC is wide open and they should have a great chance to run the table there if they don't collapse. But if you were to drop those 2 early, I think the panic buttons start going off and people start getting pretty upset. And how much buy-in is there after that? So from Miami over to the SEC, Cole, this is teed up for you. Let's talk about Auburn a little bit. And another coach that is patience maybe wearing thin a little bit with Hugh Freeze?
I would definitely say so. And surprisingly, it's a good transition because I have said for the last 2 off seasons, much like Miami in year 3 and Texas in year 3, Auburn has to act like that in year 3. So let's go back to 2024. Finished 5-7 behind Hugh Freeze, despite honestly having a pretty solid defense and a very stable offense at all positions, besides the most important one, quarterback. When you look at the numbers and the production, I honestly believe Auburn was masquerading as a bad team throughout the year because in 4 losses combined, 12 turnovers, 12 consistent turnovers, all coming from either the quarterback or on fumbles. In 3 games alone, to Cal, to Arkansas, and to Oklahoma, 3 very winnable matchups, all of which I might also add in were at Jordan-Hare Stadium. 11 total turnovers. It's not sustainable that way. When you throw 4 picks, you're going to catch yourself in a blender of concerns. And ultimately, that led to Auburn missing a bowl game, them eventually losing in the Iron Bowl, and now putting a little bit more expectations on Hugh Freeze to deliver this year. And a lot of the same reasons why we talk about Miami, we talk about Auburn. Both Hugh Freeze and Mario Cristobal are known for their recruiting assets. Back-to-back top 10 recruiting classes, headlined by multiple 4-star talents, including several 5-star talents as well, that are expected to be frontline day 1 contributors the second they touch down on the Plains. Now, they did do a good job of backportaling in some names. Eric Singleton Jr. from Georgia Tech, he's lightning in a bottle. So many people are excited about him joining this style of offense. He may end up being the best receiver in the conference when all is said and done. They also went and they brought in Jackson Arnold. I think a fresh start out of Norman, Oklahoma is what's best for him to get back to the level of that 5-star potential. You also added in Xavier Chaplin for the offensive line out of Virginia Tech and Mason Murphy from USC. Brought in some other defensive players. Xavier Atkins from LSU has an opportunity to start at middle linebacker. Dallas Walker comes in from Western Kentucky. Could be a pretty good replacement for Isaiah Rakes at the defensive tackle spot. Chris Murray from Sam Houston State was one of the best pass rushers in Conference USA last year. Now he's coming on in. He can play that Jalen McLeod role. Now, they did lose some talent, some pretty good ones. Keandre Lambert-Smith, he's off to the NFL. Rivaldo Fairweather, off to the NFL. Jarquez Hunter, a guy who very similarly reminded me of Tank Bigsby when he was working with the guy in Brian Harsin. The underutilization of the running back room, he's off to the NFL. You also lose guys like Percy Lewis to Ole Miss, Walker White to Baylor, Antonio Kite to Ole Miss. Multiple names are still staying around the SEC or on the schedule that could eventually come back to hurt you in a different location. They did a good job of finishing with a top 10 a top 10 recruiting class. 5-star Malik Autry was the headliner at defensive tackle. They also landed 4-star quarterback Deuce Knight, 4-star defensive back Anquan Fagan, who's expected to start at strong safety, 4-star defensive lineman Jordan Crawford, 4-star tight end Hollis Davidson, and 4-star wide receiver Derek Smith that will be a part of the program in summer workouts. The number 7 recruiting class in the country, boys, of the 26 recruits, 17 are 4-stars according to 247 Sports. Key games for them next year, August 30th against Baylor down in Waco, Texas. Sawyer Robertson was part of the reason why Baylor got a 6-win streak to close out 2024. How does that look when you have Dave Aranda kind of facing a little bit of pressure this year? September 20th at Oklahoma. First SEC game of the season, also first road test and Jackson Arnold's revenge game against a Brent Venables defense. And so that's going to be, I think, must-see television. October 11th against Georgia, that's the SEC home opener. Georgia will be playing, I think, Alabama the week before, and Auburn will be coming off a bye. How does that look? At Vanderbilt on November 8th. Diego Pavia, don't know if you know this, has an opportunity to go for the three-peat against Hugh Freeze. Beat him once when he was at New Mexico State, when he was at Liberty. Beat him last year when he was at Auburn. Beat him a second year. So 4 times, actually, to go beat against Hugh Freeze, which would be massive for a quarterback that a lot of people kind of slept on. And then, of course, the Iron Bowl on November 20th. What are the expectations? You got to take the jump because of, again, you're talking about back-to-back top 10 recruiting classes. You've done a good job of bringing in exceptional names on offense like Cam Coleman and Malcolm Simmons and Perry Thompson. You brought in some really good running back talent. You've been able to retain talent to leave from the transfer portal. Kedrick Falk is one of the better defensive linemen in the SEC that may have had an incredible season moving forward. And I think the biggest thing of all when I look at it is that there's so much stability when it comes to you made sure that DJ Durkin didn't take the job at Ohio State or Notre Dame. He was getting looked at for both defensive coordinator positions. So you signed him to a long-term deal. Everything is in line for this team to take that next jump forward. Some of their toughest games that they have this season are at home. The Georgia game is on the Plains. The Iron Bowl is on the Plains. The matchup against Mizzou is on the Plains. Those should be games that when you felt like they were just out of arm's reach, well, now we have the homegrown environment in our backfield. It's a very stable overall spot to where we're taking the necessary steps forward. I think 8 wins should be plausible. I think 8 wins should be the standard this year. I think that honestly, we're talking about a team that if all things go according to plan, should maybe get up to 9, 10 wins, a dark horse to be in the college football playoff run. Very similar to what we said about Miami last season. They put their money where their mouth was. They wrote blank checks to Hugh Freeze. They said, go add in the types of players that are going to better your roster in your image. It's time to start seeing the fruits of our labor be benefited. I'm very excited to see what Auburn is because they're so unpredictable, and they've always been unpredictable in our lifetime. One year they could go 4-8. The next year they win the national championship. That's just Auburn. It's the toughest job in college football. But I look at what this roster is, what they have been able to retain, and how they've been able to establish an identity underneath Hugh Freeze. At some point, it has to hit. You can't keep telling us that, yeah, we have good recruits. Yeah, we have really solid playmakers on the outside. We have very solid foundational structure internally. It gets tiresome. It gets old. And people don't want to hear that. They want to see results on the football field. Now it is time to do so. X Factor player that I'm looking for, a breakout player I'm looking for, Cam Coleman. Last year had an opportunity to kind of take some pressure off with Keandre Lambert-Smith. I think he's going to be the number 1 wide receiver in the country by the end of the year, or at least the number 1 wide receiver in the SEC. And then the X Factor, quarterback play with Hugh Freeze. It's Hugh Freeze's offense. He's the one calling the shots. You have Jackson Arnold. You also brought in Ashton Daniels from Stanford to be a potential contingency plan. You brought in Deuce Knight. That's the quarterback that you're hinging your success on. You have to be able to call the right plays for your quarterback to connect with these wide receivers, to make sure this offensive line is giving you enough ample protection, scheming up ways to trust the run game now that you don't have a guy like Jarquez Hunter in your backfield. Little things like that, the play calling from Hugh Freeze will determine what the record of, I think, Auburn is in 2025.
I look at I think part of their schedule is pretty manageable. You mentioned that Georgia game being at home, but then after that, Missouri at home, at Arkansas, Kentucky, Vandy, and Mercer in a 5-game stretch. They could go, they theoretically could go 5-0, 4-1 in that stretch and really do put themselves in a good spot. But to me, the start, September, is brutal. Now, they do have Ball State and South Alabama at home. Obviously, you wouldn't expect any shockers there. But on the road at Baylor, who is a team that was on the upswing at the end of last year, a team that does have more confidence in the Big 12 coming back this year, at Oklahoma after the 2 cupcakes, and then at A&M, all within a 5-week stretch. You do get that 2-game reprieve at home. I don't want to say their season could just be over after September, but man, if you don't take care of business, it could certainly get off the rails. And I think all 3 of those are extremely tough. I think that at Baylor is going to be tough. We've talked about Mateer at Oklahoma. We've not previewed them. And I think it's never easy to go to Kyle Field. All 3 of those could be incredibly difficult for Auburn. And if they, I mean, God forbid, if they start 2-3 or 3-2 even feels like a win coming out of that with 3 road games. If they were to start 2-3, it feels like it could go south pretty quickly.
It could. And honestly, it wouldn't shock me if it does, because it's Auburn. Auburn, in my opinion, is the toughest job in college football for 2 main elements. Number 1, you're recruiting against Georgia and Alabama. And number 2, they're always on your schedule. Both of them. They're your 2 biggest rivals. The results that we have seen over the last 3 decades down in Athens and Tuscaloosa puts pressure on the Auburn coach to have to deliver, because the boosters with the Yellowwood money, they want to see the results immediately. They're not patient down there. They believe that just because of they're not winning championships doesn't mean they shouldn't be winning on the recruiting. Doesn't mean they shouldn't be winning when it comes to portal acquisitions. Doesn't mean they should be putting out a product that is sustainable and at least challenging these 2 teams. And honestly, outside of a few blundering plays with the kick 6, with the Bo Nix game, with the 27-point comeback in the Iron Bowl, and the Hail Mary, the miracle of Drew and Hare with the catch from Ricardo Lewis, it's very much been a one-sided argument. I don't think that this is a team that we need to sleep on. What I think of this is a team that if they don't start hot, it's very easy to see the buy-in from the rest of the roster kind of play back idly. They finish 6-6, and then there's a serious conversation. What do we do with Hugh Freeze? Because at some point, this is your team now. How much of this team is all Hugh Freeze? About 89% of it, 90% of it. So if you're not able to get anything done with the people that you brought in, you're able to build up and elevate them for who they are as talents and make sure that they're competitive in these games. And I'm not saying the Georgia and Alabama game, but you should hold your own against a brand new quarterback in John Mateer on the road. You should be able to shut down a defense like Texas A&M. You did so in 4 overtimes last year. You should be able to withstand Dave Aranda's front 7 and what a guy like Sawyer Robertson brings. In my opinion, you should be undefeated going into that game against Georgia. I know it's a tall task, but you should, especially if we're talking about culture and the type of players that you have brought in, Hugh Freeze, and the type of talent that you constantly are seeing look at Auburn as a prime destination.
Yeah, with the recruiting and the talent they've had, there are really no excuses at this point. If you're watching this live or on replay, do us a favor and hit the subscribe button. The Power 2 live every Wednesday at noon Eastern. Let's move over to the Big Ten. Tom, let's talk about Maryland a little bit.
Maryland's kind of an interesting story in that I think they could rebound substantially in 2025. So looking at 2024, finished 4-8, 1-8 in the Big Ten, won all 3 of their non-cons, and then lost their first 3 Big Ten games against Michigan State, Indiana, who had a hell of a year, and Northwestern. They beat USC at home 29-28, and then lost their last 5 games by 2 scores or more in each matchup. The end of the season was 44-7 against Penn State, so that was a rough one. They finished 17th in passing yards per game nationally, but gave up nearly 400 yards per game on defense. Key additions, quarterback Justin Martin, who I've talked about before on this show, other shows. I think a lot of what he put on tape last year at UCLA, 4-star recruit coming out of Inglewood, California, was at UCLA, now completely crosses the country, and I think is entering a quarterback-friendly system. I'll get to more of that in a moment, but offensive lineman Trell Perry from Central Connecticut State University, edge D.D. Holmes from your Florida State Seminoles there. TJ, sorry about that. Wide receiver Jaleel Farouk from Oklahoma. Wide receiver Caleb Webb from Tennessee, who had limited experience. Farouk got a little bit more with Oklahoma. And then Dante Joyner from Arkansas State, the opportunity to level up from the Sun Belt. Key departures, 21 players lost to the portal, and it's one of the highest totals in the country. Now, not to the portal, Ty Felton, who was basically the entire offense at wide receiver. Caden Prather, also a substantial contributor at wide receiver and dangerous. He's off to the National Football League. Defensive end, Ruben Hippolyte, the second veteran presence, really disruptive, led the team in tackles. He's off to the National Football League. The spark on offense, quarterback Billy Edwards Jr., banged up a lot last season, but off to Wisconsin. Roman Hemby, he's off to Indiana. The running back Tight end Dylan Wade was their leading receiver at tight end, off to UCF. Marcus Dumerville off to Arkansas from the offensive line. Interior offensive lineman DeAndre Duffus to Georgia State. Cornerbacks Jonathan Atkins and Perry Fisher off to ECU and UAB, respectively. Maryland saw 7 defensive backs enter the transfer portal, so that's fun. Their top recruits, this is a top 25 recruiting class per 24/7 Sports. Quarterback Malik Washington is a 4-star. Offensive lineman Jalen Gilchrist is a 4-star. Safety Messiah Delhomme is a 4-star. Defensive lineman Bryce Jenkins, Zymir Smith, wide receiver, both 4 stars. 20 commits, 15 come from Maryland, Virginia, DC, or Pennsylvania. I like the tactic of trying to stay local and win your state. They get cannibalized quite a bit by Penn State and some of the other juggernauts in that area from multiple conferences, so you have to be able to win locally. Key games this season. At Wisconsin, that's the Big Ten opener. That's on September 20th. You'll play home against Washington on October 4th. You'll host the Nebraska Cornhuskers on October 11th. You'll be hosting Indiana, so there's a good opportunity for some revenge on November 1st, at Illinois November 15th, and then against the Michigan Wolverines on Senior Day towards the back end of the season. My expectation, Mike Locksley is going into his 8th season at Maryland. He's 33-41 overall during that time. After 3 consecutive winning seasons from 21 to 23, the Terps need to rebound this season. Locksley was lauded as a home run hire after his stint in Alabama, but the advent of NIL has damaged Maryland's ability to win their region when it comes to recruiting. As I mentioned, all the other superpowers at play. Right now, Maryland is a stepping stone Big Ten program, but 2025 is actually set up nicely. Their schedule is favorable. I could see them winning 8 games or more. The big question is offense. How do you replace Ty Felton, Caden Prather, Billy Edwards Jr., and Roman Hemby? Can the offense step up, and can the defense take a step forward? Offensively, 60% of Maryland's 2024 receiving yardage total and 57% of its rushing yardage total is gone now that those 4 aforementioned players have departed the program. As I mentioned, incoming wide receivers Farouk and Webb will be relied on. Not so much Webb. Farouk, they think they're going to be looking at more so to be a contributor as he was with the Sooners. Octavian Smith Jr. at wide receiver returning from last year. Running back Nolan Ray had a nice season last year behind Roman Hemby. Dwan Williams as well returning from last year. Ray's probably going to be the focal point in that respect. Quarterback. It's going to be a competition, but I believe in Justin Martin being the breakout player from UCLA. Playing a year behind Ethan Garbers gave him some valuable time to develop, chance to flash against Penn State when Garbers was down. Maryland's offenses under Locksley, historically, they have relied on the running game, but its best years we all remember under the dynamic Taulia Tagovailoa. I think Martin can duplicate some of those traits that Taulia had, as long as he can avoid Taulia's ability to turn the football over. My X factor defensively, linebacker Caleb Wheatland. Leading tackler Ruben Hippolyte off to the National Football League, as I mentioned. So Wheatland is someone who could step up for the defense that definitely struggled last year. Wheatland led the team in sacks, was second in TFL, second in quarterback hurries, 5th in total tackles. I look for Wheatland to provide veteran leadership and production for the Terps defense. I think this is not necessarily a year where you see Locksley on the hot seat, but if this is another losing season, if this goes off the rails, I think that would be a big surprise in College Park. You could see him bounced if they really, really struggle.
You mentioned the NIL stuff, and I asked you this last week about Purdue as well, and that being a struggle. I mean, how would you, I don't know if you have a specific number or not, but just how would you, are they in the bottom third as far as buy-in and just funds available in the Big Ten, or are they kind of more mid-level? I mean, certainly, we know who the top programs are, but just thoughts there.
I'd say they're right in the middle. I've been surprised since the advent of NIL that Under Armour, literally their biggest supporter at the University of Maryland, hasn't just shot them to the moon. I kind of look at the way that Phil Knight and Nike money has been fueling Oregon, and a number of Oregon sports for that matter. So I've been genuinely surprised that Maryland hasn't taken bigger strides in that department. The issue, and it's unfortunate that, yes, it's a stepping stone program for coaches. It's also a stepping stone program for players. How many times have we seen guys have a little bit of buzz at Maryland and then jump to someplace bigger? Chop Robinson going from Maryland to Penn State is a perfect example. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for Maryland to make some strides. As I mentioned, this schedule is set up for them to be successful and at least make a bowl game. The question is, can they find the long-term answer at quarterback? Is it Malik Washington straight out of high school? Is it Justin Martin? I think there will be some justifiable competition there. But Maryland has every reason to start making noise in the middle of the Big Ten. And frankly, with all the realignment and all the changes to the college football playoff before automatic qualifiers, that fourth spot in the Big Ten at any given year could be up for grabs. And it's who's going to win 9, maybe 10 games. I don't think Maryland's that far from it. I think Loxley is the right guy for the job, but they cannot fall flat on their faces this year.
Tom, just out of curiosity, whenever I think of Maryland, right now I'm starting to think of Kentucky. And it's not an insult towards Maryland, but it's just the reality of they feel like a stepping stool program. They're not able to retain the premier talent. They're losing names to bigger programs. And the second that they start to struggle, then we have to have the conversation of, well, is he the right guy? I love Loxley. I think Loxley did a great job offensively at Alabama. I can attest to it. He helped the team win a championship. But still, you just look at the parameters of what are the expectations out at College Park and what are supposed to be the expectations out in Lexington. I see similarities. Two coaches that are getting paid pretty handsomely go to a bowl game. I mean, is there a world where very similar to Mark Stoops, he's on fire this year, but it's win all in 2026 if you end up underachieving this upcoming fall?
Yeah, in my opinion, if Loxley has a winning season this year and makes a bowl game, and win or lose in the bowl game, you're kind of touching on it before about Miami and the Pop-Tarts Bowl. It's like, all right, the win and loss in a bowl game doesn't really mean as much as it used to. But I think if Maryland is able to rip off 8 wins this year, he's safe, and he should be safe. That's a great bounce back from 4-8. Obviously, you basically flip your record entirely. But if this is another year where it's like, hey, we make some incremental progress, but we show some hope, I could see him staying there. Again, I think if this is a losing season for Mike Loxley, you probably move on from him. But even still, it's like, all right, like there's a lot of guys out there that you could go and get that will take that job because they also see it as a stepping stone job, to your point, similar to Kentucky. And also similar to Kentucky, I just don't know if the hot seat is all that hot for them. I think they realize the limitations with this program, and it's still kind of a head scratcher to me. I'm still surprised that there's not more money and resources behind this program. But for me, Maryland is in a good position to take advantage of this season, and they have a pretty good influx of talent overall. So I like Loxley. I'm with you. It's kind of like, yeah, Stoops feels good in Kentucky, but you're not satisfied. Are they satisfied? I think if they have a losing season, they shouldn't be satisfied.
All right, we've talked about Maryland, Auburn, Miami. Let's talk a little big picture now. Something that was brought up, some things that this is said quite often, that coaches are just overrated. I've heard Pate talk about this, and his big take is no, coaches are properly rated. You just kind of like they're not elite, right? So let's talk about some coaches here. I've got 3, and then maybe we'll dive into a 4th one that I kind of thought of as we were doing this. And if you guys have other guys that we'll add into this as well, I'm for it. But James Franklin on this list consistently talked about as overrated. Brian Kelly certainly is one. Lincoln Riley, that might be one that we maybe have differing takes on too. But thoughts on, we can start with James Franklin. We can go into Brian Kelly, Lincoln Riley. Tom, I'll let you start it off just because Franklin being the first one and you being the Penn State guy. But let's talk some thoughts around, are these guys all overrated?
I think you have to define what you mean by overrated in order to have this conversation. Is like, are we talking about ring chasing? Like, can we exclude Ryan Day from this conversation because he just won a national championship? Can we practically say that Ryan Day wasn't the big driving force, lone reason why Ohio State just won a national championship? Like, are we being reasonable in that respect? Is it about how many titles you've won? Like, I get that. James Franklin inherited a team that was nearly on its deathbed. Let's not forget about Penn State under sanctions. You had walk-ons, guys off the street playing Big Ten football. So he had to take that, and he had to actually compete. And within 2-3 years, 2016, won the Big Ten championship. Now, granted, you got a generational talent in Saquon Barkley. You flipped him from Rutgers, which is just an unbelievable situation. But still, you were able to turn that around really quickly. Okay. Someone who knows Penn State intimately, that is a school historically that believes in success with honor, meaning we're not going to pay a whole lot. We're going to play money ball, and you should just want to come here and be a part of this brand. A lot of schools have experienced that for a number of years. The gut job that James Franklin has had to do to get Penn State to this point has been monumental. So when you say overrated, it's like, okay, what are we really talking about? Are we saying James Franklin and him coming up short in the big games against the top 5, top 10, top 15? Yeah, I'd be the first person to say that those have been extremely disappointing. I've attended a lot of them, but at the same time, the job that he's done has been gargantuan. Brian Kelly at Notre Dame never struggled for resources. LSU, has he struggled for resources whatsoever? Lincoln Riley, you were at Oklahoma. You did not have to do a rebuild. You went to USC. It looked like you were going to be just fine, inheriting Caleb Williams, all these sorts of things. I think you could also throw Mario Cristobal in there as somebody who got some buzz with Oregon, then went off to Miami. And yes, I'm seeing everybody in the chat, and I apologize. They've done a great job in recruiting the last few years, but I think Carson Beck is going to be a flop. How's your ROI for $4 million and a dude who gets anxiety from watching football? Best of luck to you. I think Mario Cristobal is also on this list. But again, when you're talking about overrated, it's like, what are we really discussing? Is it how many championships they've won? Because maybe you could throw Steve Sarkisian in that mix. I think some people would think that's sacrilege, but how many big time programs has he gone to and gotten great opportunities and screwed up in the past? Is Lane Kiffin overrated? All the money they're throwing around at Ole Miss, and he's complaining on social media. Like the argument needs to be framed, in my opinion.
Yeah, before Cole goes, I think when people say overrated, they're just saying they're not elite, right? Maybe that's
which is fine, but and then okay, so not elite. What does that mean?
Right.
Does that mean he's not an elite in-game tactician? Does that mean he's not an elite CEO of his program? Because then you're having multiple conversations. Dabo Sweeney, I would never call a great in-game tactician, the likes of Nick Saban, but he is obviously a great CEO of his program. The same thing for James Franklin. Great CEO, in-game tactician, I wouldn't put him in that category. So again, it's just, you need bumpers for this sort of conversation.
Yeah, they're essentially like James Franklin and Brian Kelly and Lincoln Riley. Lincoln Riley may be on the fringe of being outside of this, but the top two that we mentioned, James Franklin, Brian Kelly, and Brian Kelly's had some stinkers too, where he's lost some games he shouldn't have. Every coach does. I think when people say overrated, I think they're just saying these coaches aren't beating the coaches that are a tier above them, right? Like, which is that really being overrated? Or is that, a guy loses in a one-on-one game to LeBron? Yeah, you lost to LeBron, but you beat the other 90 coach, the other 90 players in the league or whatever. So that doesn't make you overrated to be a tier below. Cole, what are your thoughts?
I want you to tell me what is your criteria for rankings in college football coaches. And then if you're going to say championships, then remind yourself that number 1 on the list is Kirby Smart. Number 2 on the list is Dabo Sweeney, because that's your criteria, championship. And number 3 is Ryan Day. And that's the list. Those are the only active coaches currently in college football that can claim a national title. We just saw one depart at North Carolina with Mac Brown's dismissal, and all we did is replace him with Ryan frickin' Day, a dude who also, for the last 5 years, has been able to get to 11 plus wins, beat up on Penn State, not beat Michigan, but still be in the running for a college football playoff spot, and yet he is overrated. What type of tomfoolery are we living in where you honestly think that a coach that constantly is getting to top 10 wins in college football, finding ways to be ranked inside the AP in college football top 15 yearly, finishing in the top half of their recruiting cycle in their conference in 5-star talents. They're making sure they're bringing in the right cultures in the transfer portal. They're constantly putting themselves in prime position to at least compete for a college football playoff spot. Do people not understand that 10 wins in college football, regardless of what conference you're in, regardless of what your schedule looks like, is daunting in itself? Because some teams, they don't have a bye week for the first 6 weeks. Injuries start to stockpile up. You start losing talent. You have to be able to stockpile names that may only be utilized on 30% of snaps. So Brian Kelly is not an overrated head coach. Do I think that he's no longer a top 5 head coach in college football? I'd go on that, especially with his underwhelmingness during his tenure in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. But that doesn't mean that he's not a top 10 head coach. And the same thing goes for James Franklin. 6 years of 10 plus wins. And in any other college football playoff format over the last decade, Penn State would be the 5th most represented team in terms of appearances in the college football playoff. It's a struggle that, unfortunately, every single year they had to face off against Michigan, who won a national title, and Ohio State, who's won a national title. Those are two coaches that constantly put their teams in positions to get to double-digit wins, put their teams in positions to compete alongside some of the best in college football, put themselves in positions to find their season ranked with a number attached to their name, and certainly now in a 12-team playoff era, be a constant force in the postseason. You talked about a guy like Mario Cristobal being a name. What about Hugh Freeze? Freeze has been living off of 2 back-to-back wins against Nick Saban. You want to also had 2 wins against Nick Saban? Gus Malzahn. And those out on the Plains could not be more elated to see him depart for a program like UCF. And then they bring in Brian Harsin. Jimbo Fisher beat Nick Saban, an unranked Texas A&M squad. And 2 years later, he was fired from his job. So what is the criteria in your terms of being able to say, oh, overrated coach? Because if you're talking about conference championships, okay, well, James Franklin qualifies to not be overrated because he's won a conference championship. Guess who else has won a conference championship? Billy frickin' Napier in the Sun Belt. So he qualifies. Matt Rule qualifies for winning for competing in one in the American Conference Championship. It's your criteria that doesn't add up. If you don't like that James Franklin can't win the big one, so be it. But then name 9 other coaches that are constantly beating top 10 teams. And if you don't like Brian Kelly because of he's an asshole, just say it. It's a bad argument, but it's the only one that you got if you want to talk about overrated. It is sickening. It is beyond frustrating. And more importantly, it's just dumb takes by idiots on the internet who want your attention. Here's your 15 seconds for me to go ahead and lose my shit. I don't really care anymore because unfortunately, you have no idea what you're talking about when you put James Franklin and Brian Kelly with the word overrated in the same sentence. You have no idea what you're talking about. Go ahead and start learning college football 101 and come back to me later.
It's almost like if the expectations aren't as high, like we are, and I don't mean this as a shot, but like nobody would call Brent Key overrated, right? And this isn't a shot at Georgia Tech because I think they're building things the right way, and I'm really kind of excited for where that program's going. But Brent Key's expectations aren't to beat Ohio State, and Brent Key's his personal expectation, but like the expectations around Georgia Tech are not to be 10, 11, 12 game winners every year. And I think they'll get there, and I think he's building the right way. So trying to understand me. Same thing with Matt Campbell at Iowa State. Oh, he's a name that's always on the fringe of these top 15, top 20 lists. He's always right around there. But nobody calls him overrated because he's at Iowa State. Nobody expects them to beat Bama every other year or beat Ohio State or Georgia every other year. And so these coaches, but if we just take a step back and we look at, Brian Kelly versus Brent Key or James Franklin versus Matt Campbell, nobody would ever put one over the other. But do you think that Brian Kelly should be rated behind Brent Key right now? Like, does anybody really believe that? Does anybody really believe that James Franklin should be rated behind Matt Campbell? And so again, I think it's all about within context. Yeah. Has Brian Kelly struggled to win it all and win the big game and, get to the, well, I guess he did get to the SEC championship his first year, but yeah, has he been
the worst roster he's had on campus there too?
Yeah. Is there some underwhelming that goes on? Sure. But to call somebody overrated because their expectations are higher is a silly part of the argument to me.
I mean, how quickly did people in Florida State start calling Norvell overrated this past season when it was one choice away from being in the college football playoff had Jordan Travis not been injured and had a ridiculous decision not been made? No one would be saying that. But the second things got bad, Norvell's overrated. Last season was a fluke, blah, 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 blah. Come on.
I mean, are you guys seeing right now College Football Home? If you don't, they're a fun Twitter site. They're doing a college football head coaching bracket. Brent Key beat Kalen DeBoer. Like, are we seriously sitting here like, and I love Brent Key, but are we seriously going to sit here and say you would take Brent Key over Kalen DeBoer, who has a winning percentage of 79.2%? Oh, but he lost 4 games last year in his first season, replacing the go to Alabama. I'll tell you, Coach, that we need to start putting on that conversation. And I love him to death, and I know he won't care if I say this. Joey McGuire at Texas Tech. Because honestly, when they're spending the type of money that they are this offseason, with how they believe that they're only a few pieces away and what their schedule is in the Big 12, I think he should be competing at least for a spot in Arlington. And if you can't do that after what type of progress we've seen over the last few years without the resources, maybe the head coaching job is probably something that we have to kind of transpire about. Is this really made for you? Because there were some stinkers last season, I think, out in Lubbock as well for a really solid Red Raider team.
That's what I was going to ask next. This is not the wild card. This is not my question for you, but Cole just gave us one. Tom, who is an overrated head coach in college football?
Wow. Sharon Moore. I'll start there.
I'll buy that. It's early. We'll see what they do this year. I'm excited for our Michigan preview, but I'll buy it.
Listen, like, he got put in a situation at Michigan where they nearly left him holding the bag, and not in a good way. Like, they nearly left him as the fall guy for the Harbaugh stuff. So you probably believed in him enough to give him the job, but not enough to believe in him long term, that sort of situation. It remains to be seen whether or not he can continue to recruit at a high level. Obviously, the money is there. They've continued to recruit well, but it's super early, to your point. So I think you could maybe say that now. It's it'd be the beginning of that argument, but I'm not entirely sold on Sharon Moore just yet. I think Lincoln Riley has to be in this mix, because if you're talking about ring chasing, well, he's not there. And it's you're getting Heismans. That's great. That's like winning the MVP in the NBA, but then doing absolutely nothing in the postseason. Congratulations, Lincoln Riley. And he might be out of USC within the next year or two. So, yeah, that's a tough one. I'm going to say Sharon Moore, but it's super early.
I will say that, and hate to do this to you, buddy TJ, but I think Mike Norvell's overrated. I never wanted him even in the conversation for the job with the Alabama gig. I had some question marks after how they weren't able to kind of recoup in the transfer portal. I thought they were too portal dependent last year, and ultimately that led to a 2-10 finish with the overall results. Do I think he's a solid coach? Absolutely. Do I think that he could be great at a G5 level like he did when he was at Memphis? Absolutely. But I think if the expectations are at Florida State for you to be in that conversation of 9+ wins every single year, it may be a 2-year stretch, or it may be, one bad season. I don't know. There's not enough visual evidence, but this is a critical year on changing my opinion when it comes to Mike Norvell. Another one that I just want to throw out there that I don't think overrated is the right word, but it's starting to get a little frustrating. It's Luke Fickell. I'm sorry. I love Luke Fickell. He was my favorite hire because of just what he was able to accomplish at the G5 level and how many people were saying waiting in line to go land at a place like Ohio State, or then he was up for the Notre Dame job and then he went to Wisconsin. But at the same time, Wisconsin has completely changed its aura about how they go about things. When I think of Wisconsin football, I think meat, potatoes, son of a bitch that wants to punch you in the mouth, and they don't have that physicality on the ground. They don't have that physicality in the trenches, and it feels like that they're underwhelming at the quarterback position. Once again, I'm not saying that I don't think Danny O'Neal or that Billy Edwards can't be serviceable, but serviceable is not what you let Paul Chryst go for. You let go of Paul Chryst because you felt like you hit your ceiling, and you brought in a coach, and you just extended a coach that nobody was targeting at this time for a reason that doesn't add on up. I want to see results, and unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to see them in year 3 for a guy that we had high hopes that could be considered now at a Power 4 program, a top 10 coach in college football by the end of his first season in Madison.
I'll tell you, it's hard for me to disagree with you on the Norvell thing. It's been 5 years, 2 really good years, 3 losing seasons, the most disastrous fall from grace we've ever seen to go from 13-0 down to 2-10. And I think there's a lot of questions. I think my overall take is on Norvell. I think he can build the program enough to consistently compete in the ACC. To win the ACC consistently, no, I don't think I'd say that. But I think he can consistently be one of those top 3 teams, even with the poor recruiting that I think has gone on. I think he can do that. I think Florida State's logo itself will recruit a top 3 class in the ACC almost every single year. Heck, he did it this year with 2 wins. But I don't know that I believe he's the guy that could win national championships. And ultimately, that's the expectation, is to compete for that. So, yeah, I don't know that I disagree with you too much there. I mean, now, if they go on a run and win 9+ games for the next 4 years, then I'll probably view that a little bit differently.
Yeah.
But even as an FSU homer, I wouldn't say, you go 2-10 and it shocks you, your core, and you do question everything again. Whereas a year ago, I would have thought, he's a top 10 coach in the league or in the country, and we're going to continue to roll. And if they'd have just gone 8-4 this year, I'd probably still be like, yeah, I mean, down year, but they'll be back next year. So it's hard to disagree with that, and I'm a homer. I want them to win every game, but at the same time, call a spade a spade. Like I think that I just don't know that his focus or emphasis on recruiting is high enough. And as much as I hate Mario Cristobal in Miami, and Billy Napier in Florida, like, I mean, they get dudes, and so like Florida State's not doing that right now. And we'll see if they turn that around or not. So, all right, last thing up today, the wild card. We are going to, this kind of fits in really well with everything we've done here, but we are going to play a game of Contender or Pretender.
Ooh, yay.
We've got 5 teams, and here's the game within the game. Somebody's going to win this. Well, I guess you could win 5-0 or 3-2, but there's 5, and I'm going to pick a winner after each round. I'm going to alternate who goes first, who goes second. We'll give it to Tom first to make it easier. You have to take the other side, right?
Yes.
If Tom takes the first team as a contender, Cole, you got to take them as a pretender, and you've got to convince me. And so we're going to alternate. Tom's going first because he won last week, so he does have the advantage. He gets to call his shot 3 times.
Rules, I like it.
Cole has to call it 2 times. Tom with a little bit of an advantage. Cole will get the advantage on whatever next week's game is. Contender or pretender. I went with teams that just barely missed the playoff last year, so this should be pretty easy for you. I'm not going with, Colorado. Like, this is a contender or pretender to, like, maybe not necessarily compete for a national title, more so compete for getting into that 12-team playoff. Nobody was more upset last year with how things went down than Alabama. Tom, you get to start us off with the Crimson Tide.
Man. I'm going to say contender. They have to be able to turn it around quickly. Unfortunately, like the clock on Kalen DeBoer, I think, has already started. Losing Jalen Milroe and some significant pieces on defense are going to really, really hurt. But I think Alabama still has the depth that they can try and rebound. I think what they're going to be able to do at quarterback and offensively this year, especially getting Grubbs, is that this offense is going to look a lot closer to what historically Kalen DeBoer has wanted to do. It felt like a square peg in a round hole with Jalen Milroe this past season. I think no matter who comes out playing quarterback, they'll be able to mold things a little bit better there at Alabama. I think they've gotten a better fix on what their roster stability is going to look like going forward, and an understanding of like, hey, that first year was insane. We were taking over for Nick Saban and company. A lot of guys jumped in the portal. A lot of guys came in the portal. I think they should have a better fix on their roster. I could see, I'm going to say a contender to make the playoff.
Well, unfortunately, I have to sell this as a pretender. So let's go ahead and start off with the fact that I have questions when it comes to the running back room. This was a very solid unit last year with Jam Miller and Justice Haynes. I thought there should have been more of an emphasis on trusting that ground game and not just targeting number 4 to be the backbone of your offense. And unfortunately, it felt like Kalen DeBoer kind of pulled away from that. They lose Justice Haynes to Michigan. They do bring back Jam Miller. They have some young guys that can be X factors for this team. But still, what if you start relying so codependently on the quarterback? Keep in mind that when we talk about a Kalen DeBoer style offense, they love to tote the rock. They love to uncork it. One of the biggest things that stood out about Washington's run for 2 years was Michael Penix Jr. led the country and finished top 3 in almost every single metric. So if the quarterback play is insufficient, whether it's Austin Mack, whether it's the 5-star Keelan Russell, whether it's Ty Simpson, you're watching wide receivers drop balls, Jeremy Bernard doesn't hit his stride, Isaiah Horton doesn't hit his stride, you're so codependent on the run game. And if you turn away from the run game, then unfortunately, you're going to watch you throw in a double coverage. Your defense is going to be tired, and it's going to lead to opportunities for teams to strike. And I do think that this defense is overall solid, but there are going to be some missing holes. What do you do to replace Deontay Lawson early on in the year? Do you feel like that losing Jahad Campbell could end up being a blunder? How do you replace the secondary with the veteranship of a Malachi Moore? And then you throw in their schedule. I'm not saying that they're going to lose every single game, but you are going to play against Vanderbilt again. Does this happen 2 years in a row? What do we see from Tennessee this upcoming season with Nico Iamaleava's progression? What about LSU? I personally believe that Garrett Nussmeier is the best quarterback in the SEC, and they're coming to your turf. Nothing more would salivate Brian Kelly's chops than being able to say, I beat Kalen DeBoer in his backyard. The Iron Bowl, voodoo magic happens at Jordan-Hare Stadium every single time that these two face off against each other. It's why the kick six occurred. It's why Bo Nix had a good game. It was the 4 overtime victory and 4th and 31 just for you to be able to save face. I think that Alabama is a contender, but I will say this. There are a lot of tricks there are a lot of potholes in their schedule that could lead to some slip-ups. And then if there's any loss to the locker room, ultimately a 9-3, 8-4 finish could be on the horizon.
Yeah, I think 9-3 is most likely for them, which has them right on the edge. So they're actually the best team to do for this, because 9-3 is probably going to have them somewhere between 11th and 14th again. And if an auto bid steals a spot, they're going to be on the outside looking in again. Now, 10-2 certainly gets them in, but you mentioned the schedule at Georgia this year, Tennessee, LSU, Oklahoma, at Auburn. It's certainly not easy. I'm not telling you who wins each round either, by the way. I do have it marked down, but I won't let you game it too much just in case. We're going to each one blind. All right, next up, Cole's going to start us off with South Carolina.
I love South Carolina. I think South Carolina is a very solid team underneath Shane Beamer, but they are a pretender in 2025. And the only reason why is because I think that what you're losing defensively is going to be too hard to overcome. I love the portal additions. I think that Gabriel Brownlow-Dindy fits Clayton White's defense. I think that Brandon Cisse, the NC State cornerback, fits this hard-nosed style of defense that you like seeing underneath Clayton White. I think that Jalen Kilgore is going to take another step forward. I think that you're going to see an All-American season from Dylan Stewart, but it's so hard to duplicate that same type of success that you had in the secondary with Nicky Manwari, with what you had in the SEC Defensive Player of the Year in Kyle Kennard, what you had in Terrence Knight Demetrius Knight at linebacker, what you had with Debo Williams at linebacker, Tonka Hemingway, TJ Sanders on the defensive line. And so you're putting a lot more pressure on Lenore Sellers to have to take that necessary step forward. One of the biggest blessings for Lenore Sellers that time last year was we actually got to see Rocket Sanders look more like Rocket Sanders that he was at Arkansas. He's now gone off to the NFL. I think Rasul Faison coming on in from Utah State is a really solid conditioning running back. He can pair well with some of the younger guys. He can pair well with Oscar Attaway. But you also want to see that next step forward with some of your wide receivers. What's Mazeo Bennett going to be like in year 2? What's Nick Harbor going to be like in year 2? What are you going to see from Michael Smith, the former 4-star tight end? And then you look at their schedule. There are some trip-ups. Week 1 against Virginia Tech, are we going to see the Hokies actually look like the Hokies of old? Are we going to see Vanderbilt get to see Baba Yaga live up to his expectations? Diego Pavia on a warpath of winning an SEC title? What about the game against Missouri early on in the season? At LSU, against Oklahoma, against Alabama, at Ole Miss, at Texas A&M, you're going to be facing off, I think, a much more stable version of a Clemson offense headlined by, for my money, the best quarterback in college football in Kay Klubnik. It's just very challenging to say that the season that we saw last year can be duplicated. I think they're an 8-4 team. I think they're going to hit the over on the win total by Vegas, but I'm not ready to put them in that 12-team college football playoff picture just yet.
Tom, convince me otherwise.
I think Lenore Sellers will be the best quarterback in the SEC in 2025. I think the return of Stewart obviously is a huge factor there for this team. And I agree with all the points that Cole just said about what they have to do in terms of supplying Sellers with weapons. I actually think the inverse of Cole in regards to this schedule. I'm not that worried about Virginia Tech. I'm not as worried about Vanderbilt as I was last year, considering you get that game at home. On the road against Mizzou worries me a bit. I think Bo Perbula will give a different look to that offense. I think that's going to be curious. Hosting Kentucky doesn't scare me. At LSU, that makes you a little nervous. Hosting Oklahoma, you feel good about that. Hosting Alabama, that's a scary one, but you get it
homecoming game too. That's always a fun one.
I like that. Yeah. South Carolina at Ole Miss. What does Austin Simmons potentially look like there for the Rebs? At Texas A&M, not as worried about that. Hosting Coastal Carolina, hosting Clemson at the end of the year. I could see this being a 10-2 season for South Carolina. The entire season, unfortunately, and fortunately for all of us as fans, is going to hinge on that last game of the year, because you have the potential ACC champion, likely ACC champion in Clemson. You get them at home, you get the rivalry game, and it could be very well a play-in game. So the entire thing, I think, could hinge on that. Honestly, looking at this schedule, every team that they're playing against, while some of them, yes, they are scary, there's a lot of question marks for the other teams within this schedule. And I think great quarterback play can elevate you beyond a lot of these ones. And I like Lenore Sellers versus the field in virtually every one of these matchups. And I think Shane Beamer and company were onto something last year. They're out with something to prove. And that's important with teams coming back and they feel like they were slighted last year. They feel like they got screwed in the bowl game. I think this is an SC team that's out to kill this coming year.
Stay in the SEC for the last time here. Tom, let's go with LSU.
Pretender. I'm not buying it. I'm not buying it. I want to believe that Brian Kelly is the right guy. And like, yes, I've seen what they've done in terms of a recruiting standpoint. I don't buy Nussmeier. I just don't. The entire way that this LSU team has been put together by Brian Kelly, yes, it's encouraging, all these things on paper. And to the points that we were talking about earlier on the show, if you just don't like him because you don't like him, that's not a good reason. I don't know. I just don't like the way that they fall within this conference. Like, it doesn't fit for me. It doesn't fit the way that I believe Texas, Georgia, and credibly Alabama, South Carolina, and Ole Miss are going to be jockeying for position at the top of this conference, not to mention the outliers that always happen in the SEC. I just don't see a world where LSU breaks through all that.
This is easy for me. They were an easy contender. So thank you for just giving me this on a silver platter. Number one, they returned one of the only few quarterbacks that threw for over 4,000 yards last year. People want to talk about his turnover rate. Let me also remind you, had 112 more pass attempts than anybody else in the SEC. That's going to lead to you having a few more margins of errors. And Carson Beck and Quinn Ewers, they also had 12 interceptions. So make sure you throw that in your notes when you want to call Garrett Nussmeier overrated. Number one, returning receiver, and Aaron Anderson is back. I love what they brought in terms of Nick Anderson from Oklahoma. He was an All-American freshman, 10 touchdowns before suffering an injury last year that kept him out most of the season. I think bringing in a guy like Barrion Brown for that speed element is so critical when you have a cannon of an arm like number 13 has. The big question mark that I have is, can you finally trust the run game? I think Caden Durham is the best running back to come through Baton Rouge, probably since Clyde Edwards-Helaire. There were moments last season where you saw him be able to kind of take over games and continue to tote the rock. How do they make up for the departure of guys like Miles Frazier and Garrett Dellinger and Will Campbell? Well, they brought in Josh Thompson from Northwestern, and they brought in several other offensive linemen from the transfer portal. Their defense, all the money that was utilized for Bryce Underwood, that was brought in to fix the front seven and fix the pass rush. They went and they got Jack Pyburn from Florida. They went and they landed a really solid Patrick Payton. They landed great secondary players like Tamarcus Cooley, and they have some veterans that have a good understanding about what Blake Baker wants last year. Plus, they're returning Harold Perkins that's going to return to that star spot. They have the Honky Badger, who, by the way, not only is the best nickname in college football, but he's one of the best linebackers in college football and enforcers up the middle. And they, I think, have a very manageable schedule. Yes, the Clemson game bothers me, but you welcome Florida to your home turf. I don't know what Ole Miss is going to be in 2025. I think that South Carolina's defense is taking a step back. You're not losing on the road in Nashville. Texas A&M, okay, we've heard this story before. Marcel Reed, actually throw a football this time instead of trusting your legs. What's Alabama going to be? Oklahoma, is John Mateer going to be able to hold on late in the season? Have they waved the white flag in Memorial Stadium? This is a 10-win team on paper. This is a 10-win roster when you look at the returning production, and they have the quarterback to do so all the way to lead them to New York City and potentially even Miami Gardens, Florida for a shot at a national championship. If not now, when, Brian Kelly? This feels like the time to strike.
All right, we're going to wrap it at 3. I am going to give Alabama to Tom. I'm going to give South Carolina to Cole. LSU is incredibly difficult. I'm going to give I'm not as sold on their portal stuff. I'm going to give it to Tom. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Cole had a compelling argument. I really do.
Listen, maybe it's just the Pat Payton thing for me coming from Florida State, but I'm not as sold there. I think they're just on the outside looking in. So I'm going to give it to Tom. We do have to wrap. I have a couple more we'll add to an end next week at the end if we have time. Cole, Mr. Cole Thompson on Twitter, Tom Hannifan. All one word, Tom Hannifan on Twitter, X, Instagram for both these guys. We appreciate you guys for tuning in to The Power 2. We will talk to you next week. You guys have a good one.